Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome in from the cold, and welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Jane Harmon, President and CEO, and really stunned that we have a full house in this kind of weather. Obviously, we have rock stars on stage. In Wilson's 14 points, he saw international trade as a vehicle for peace and prosperity. That's why it is fitting that the Wilson Center, which is the living memorial to our first internationalist president, along with Johns Hopkins University Press, published Globalization and America's Trade Agreements by our senior policy scholar, Bill Krist. The book, which offers this town a template for meaningful trade negotiations, cannot come at a more important time. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, known as TTIP, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, loom large at the top of the global economic agenda. As my friend and former law partner Mickey Cantor, himself a former U.S. trade representative, said recently, quote, "It's about jobs. It's about our economy. It's how we relate to the rest of the world. It's about U.S. leadership. It's a big deal." A recent EU study found that TTIP is a win-win for both the EU and the U.S. The pact is predicted to usher in increases in the EU's GDP and a bounce in the U.S. GDP by 2027. This is on top of what TPP will do. According to the Peterson Institute, more from Fred, the deal provides global income benefits of an estimated $223 billion per year by 2025. Security is my bag, as many of you know. I served for 9 terms in the U.S. Congress, and I agree with many of the commentators, like former National Security Advisor Tom Donilon, who say that the precursor to security is a strong economy. We can't have economic security without strong trade regimes, and America will either be in them or left behind. However, there is an 800-pound gorilla, and that is my former employer, the Congress. There will not be TPP or TTIP, assuming they are well negotiated, without trade promotion authority. All the years I served in Congress, I supported fast track, a tough vote because of some labor opposition. But it is imperative that Congress go back to the rules that enable Congress to pass these trade agreements, and unless there's confidence that Congress will do this, it will be difficult to close the negotiations. There is news that a TPA extension will be introduced soon this year, but again, it won't pass unless there's real leadership on both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue. A deal on fast track can also serve as a bipartisan blueprint for cooperation on other fronts. So, here to help us understand where we have been and where we are going is our senior policy scholar, Bill Krist. In true Wilsonian fashion, Bill has alternated between policymaker and scholar, serving as an assistant USTR and a scholar at the center. My colleague on the Trilateral Commission and an old friend, Fred Bergston, Director Emeritus of the Peterson Institute and a former Assistant Secretary of Treasury for International Affairs, will join Bill for a discussion moderated by our very own Northeast Asia Program Associate, Shihoko Goto. Please let me turn the forum over to Shihoko, and I failed to introduce among our famous guests in the audience, Fiji Ambassador Winston Thomas. Welcome, sir. Nice to see you. The program starts right now.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for your words, which are particularly appreciated given the power Congress wields over the future of both TPP and TTIP. I'm Shihoko Goto. As Jane said, I'm the Northeast Asia Associate here at the Wilson Center's Asia program. I want to take this opportunity before I hand the floor over to Bill to thank the programs that have also sponsored this particular event, which are the Latin America program, the Mexico Institute, the Canada Institute, and the Global Europe program. Given that we do have a very full house today, it really speaks volumes about the importance of the issues of global trade, which is not just an economic issue. It is politically charged, not just in the United States, but also in Japan and in worldwide. It is also at the heart of the U.S. rebounds to Asia on the economic front. It is a game changer, not just in trade, but it will also have impact socially as well as environmentally. And I know that Bill has many insights into the topic, and without further ado, Bill.
Thank you, Shihoko, and thank you very much for the nice introduction, Jane, and especially thank you for your leadership here at the Center. And before I start, I really want to just acknowledge Kent Hughes for all the encouragement and support he's given me over the last couple years in pulling this book together. And I want to thank Fred for coming today. I think all of you know the enormous contribution that he's made to international economic policy in recent decades, and so I'm very honored to have him here. Well, several years ago, Murray Wiedenbaum, who had been President Reagan's chairman of Council Advisors, spoke here at the Center. And he was talking about how to build a better consensus for U.S. trade policy. I think a lot of free trade advocates often say, all we got to do is go out and tell the public about the benefits of trade, and then they'll start to support it. Well, Murray took a different tack, and I agree with his tack. Basically, what he said in his speech was, moving to the high middle ground on globalization is difficult and will take time. Developing a feeling of trust, or at least common understanding, is a badly needed precondition. But in order to achieve real progress, we must break the ice by taking the concerns of the critics seriously and responding with constructive action rather than just more talk. Well, that really resonated with me. I've always believed in the benefits of free trade, in the boost to the economy that you get from expanded competition, and the value of just exchange of ideas with other peoples and other countries. But a lot of times in my career, I've seen the rough edges of free trade up close. People do lose their jobs, companies do go out of business, industries come and go. If trade agreements aren't constructed right, there can be pollution effects, and developing countries are often bypassed by trade agreements. So that's why I started this book. I wanted to take Murray's thought really to heart and take a look at the critics of our trade agreements. And I decided to focus on trade agreements, particularly the WTO, our FTAs with 20 countries, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Transatlantic trade and investment, because these are really the pinnacle of trade policy. These are where everything really comes together. They have the most impact, and this is where a lot of the criticism is focused. So I decided to focus on that. Well, I think you all know the positives of our trade agreements, and Jane mentioned them, the value to their commerce and the economy, and also the foreign policy, national security interests in our trade agreements. So I cover that in my book. I'm not going to waste time here going over that. Instead, I want to really get to the concerns of the critics. I think our trade agreements have done the most to meet the concerns of the environmental community. They've done some to meet concerns that people have regarding economic development. So I'll go over those areas fairly lightly, and I want to concentrate more on the area where I think very little has been accomplished, and that's the concerns of labor. Well, looking first at the environment, as you all recall, this issue really exploded during the NAFTA negotiations. Since that time, a fair amount has happened. In 1999, President Reagan issued an executive order that environmental assessments be conducted on all trade agreements. And then in 2001, when the Doha round was launched, there was a very large environmental component to it of trying to eliminate trade barriers on environmental goods and services and curb subsidies that lead to overfishing. And then recently, a lot of U.S. FTAs, free trade agreements, require the parties to adhere to the requirements of specified multilateral environmental agreements. So those are a couple of the things that have been done. There's been a good bit. There's more that needs to be done. The biggest concern of the environmental community, I think, is with the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. As you all know, this allows companies, foreign companies, to bring a case to an arbitrator panel for a binding resolution of the dispute. I think it's important in order to make sure that investment access of our trade agreements is a reality and can't be undermined. But it's also a system that's been abused a good bit. And I think that those abuses have to be dealt with. There needs to be things in the procedures like an appellate body review, like you have in WTO dispute settlement and some other provisions. So I think people are right to be concerned about those provisions. I think the provisions are good, but there needs to be improvements there. Well, looking at economic development, that really came to the fore at the end of the Uruguay round. The developing countries, after that was completed, came to believe that a lot of them believed that they were sold a bill of goods in the Uruguay round. Some of the elements in that agreement, particularly the trade-related intellectual property, turned out to be very expensive to implement. They didn't really have intellectual property that would benefit from that. Some of the benefits they were expecting, like the limits on agricultural subsidies by developed countries, weren't coming about. So they were resisting launching the Doha round. And when it was launched in 2001, it was dubbed the Doha Development Agenda. Well, I think that nomenclature caused some problems. I think some of the more advanced developing countries felt that meant they didn't have to really do anything. And on the U.S. and the EU side, without improved access to China and India and Brazil, they weren't willing to go ahead and particularly to deal with agricultural subsidies. So I don't think Doha is going to get resolved unless that impasse is resolved. And I think it could be, but it's not an easy one. But as you know, the WTO did salvage, I think, a significant agreement at the recent ministerial on trade facilitation. And I think as the next decade goes by and that's implemented, that can really result in a lot of reduced customs barriers in developing countries, which will really spur their growth. Looking at our bilateral free trade agreements, I think our agreements could do a better job on the economic development front. For example, we require duty-free access to our partners for agricultural products that we heavily subsidize. I think a lot of economists believe that subsidized American corn flowing into Mexico really hurt a lot of small farmers. I think there's also a lot of questions that our bilateral agreements don't clearly allow developing countries to impose capital controls in the event of a financial emergency. And I think that that needs to be really clear. As many of you know, the IMF changed its position on that a couple years ago to recommend that developing countries be allowed to do that. So I think it needs to be clear that if in that event that that's exempt from investor-state dispute settlement cases and so forth, so that can be a real tool. Well, let me turn to labor. Let me get a drink first. And before I do that, let me just tell you a quick story about these three guys who are stranded on a desert island. So all they got is a big carton filled with cans of beans, and they're sitting around trying to figure out, okay, how do we get at the beans? The first guy is a physicist, and he takes his glasses off, and he says, well, we'll shine the sun onto the beans, they'll heat up, they'll explode, then we'll eat the beans. Okay, so the second guy's a chemist, and he says, that's not going to work. beans are going to be all over the island. Let's put them in salt water, let the salt water dissolve the cans, and then we'll eat the beans. Okay, luckily the third guy's an economist. He says, that's going to take too long. We'll starve to death by then. Let's just assume we have a can opener. Okay, so I want to talk about 3 can opener assumptions that are often made that have an impact on labor. And the first is the law of comparative advantage, which is really a bedrock, I think, of economic theory, and I certainly totally agree with it. I don't disagree with it for a second. Under that theory, of course, each country exports what it can produce most efficiently and imports goods that it's less efficient at. So production's more efficient, consumers benefit from lower prices, countries are better off. But under economic theory, within each country, there's winners and losers. And for the US, our comparative advantage is capital and technology, so that's where the winners are. And our disadvantage is labor, and particularly unskilled labor, so they lose. Well, so the first can opener assumption is that everyone will be better off because winners can compensate losers. For example, Dominic Salvatore says in his economic textbook, the loss that trade causes to labor is less than the gains received by owners of capital. With an appropriate redistribution policy of taxes on owners of capital and subsidies to labor, both broad classes of factors of production can benefit from international trade. Well, we do have trade adjustment assistance. That's a step towards doing that. But Congress continually debates whether to do it or not. And in any case, it's not adequate. If you're a textile worker that gets unemployed because of expanded international trade, you may end up working in McDonald's, depressing the wages of food servers. So the impact really kind of spreads throughout the economy, and you really get into a situation where what's needed is a better social safety net. Well, the second can opener assumption I want to mention is that economics assumes that trade will be balanced. Stephen Cohen, for example, says in Fundamentals of U.S. Foreign Trade Policy, the theory of comparative advantage assumes that trade is balanced. If trade is not balanced, the surplus country must be exporting some goods in which it does not have a true comparative advantage. Well, the U.S. has had a trade deficit most years since 1971. Our trade deficit is not cyclical. It is a structural deficit. If you go by commerce figures, in 2012, our trade deficit was $560 billion, and that would equal some 2.8 million jobs. So the third can opener assumption is one by David Ricardo that I want to mention. He assumed, and I think economics has assumed, that you'd have diminishing returns to scale. That is, as your grower of grapes wanted to expand production, he would have to use less fertile land, and therefore each additional barrel of grapes would cost more than the last barrel. And that was probably very true in 1817. But today, there's an awful lot of products that are produced under increasing returns to scale. For example, the longer your production run is on semiconductors or automobiles or airplanes, the lower your cost per each unit. Well, that has extremely important implications for policy. It means that comparative advantage can be created. It means that if an industry starts to lose market share because of trade distortions, it can lose competitiveness. And so I think that's one reason why the U.S. auto industry is so concerned about having full access to the Japanese market, so they'll have a level playing field. Well, given these three things, I think it's easy to see why labor has consistently opposed and had reservations on our trade agreements. So how do we reconcile this? Well, of course, the first thing that we need to do, and probably most countries, we got to create more jobs. That's another topic. An improved trade adjustment assistance is a partial answer, but a better answer is a good safety net. We need to deal with our trade deficit, which I think injures our economy and creates instability in the world's financial system. I'm not going to get into that now. There's a lot of explanations, I think, for our trade deficit. A big one is U.S. fiscal policies, our continued federal budget deficits, a tax structure that doesn't encourage savings and investment and things like that. But some of it is due to trade policies of our trade partners that take advantage of loopholes and gaps in the international trade rules. I think the biggest gap has to do with currency manipulation. I think economists have long considered this one of the most egregious trade distortions. It can inhibit imports and it can provide an artificial boost to exports. So I think that's a critical thing to be remedied. And other gaps include things like forced technology transfer and lack of discipline on state-owned enterprises. Well, so how do we move forward? I look at the TTP and the TTIP as a really kind of a terrific opportunity to develop trade rules that will really improve the world's trade system. To be a template for that, to really improve the rules between those countries and also eventually the multilateral rules, they have to address the concerns of the critics of trade policy, and we have to listen to the concerns of our negotiating partners. So just to quickly sum up some of the things that we need to do, and there's other things that I haven't mentioned, like intellectual property protection, that have major concerns around that area too. But specifically, fixing the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, not demanding access, full access for agricultural products that we heavily subsidize, allowing controls on short-term capital, filling the gaps in the international rules, particularly currency manipulation and state-owned enterprises. And last, and maybe most important, I think the U.S. needs to do a better job of aligning our domestic policies with the realities of globalization, particularly the fiscal policies and our social safety net. These negotiations have important foreign policy objectives. I think it's important to keep that in mind. Vietnam wants to become a market-oriented economy, and the TTP is an excellent opportunity for that. Abe wants to restructure the Japanese economy, and again, it's a terrific opportunity to let him do the things that he wants to do where you can build up more support. But these agreements can really exacerbate tensions with countries that aren't part of them, and I think we have to be very, very aware of that. I think that U.S. negotiators have to be very careful to consult with other countries, and particularly China and India and others that may be looking at these and having some concern. And the agreements have to be constructed so that other countries can join them later without having that be an impossibility. So if that's all done, if these are done right, I kind of see it as a chance to create a WTO plus. In other words, this would be a fairly wide, substantial trading area where the members benefit from all of that access, and in exchange they agree to a higher level of discipline. Okay, with that, let me turn the discussion over to Fred, and thank you very much. I'm looking forward to questions and comments.
Well, let me start by congratulating Bill and Kent and Jane and the Wilson Center for publishing this book at this time. In my view, this is the most active important and exciting period in U.S. trade policy since World War II. Now, some people say the early 90s were bigger when we did NAFTA and completed the Uruguay round of the WTO. In my view, that pales by comparison with the prospect for completing a Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Agreement. This is bringing together the three major economic centers of the world, with the U.S. as the pivot between them, into agreements whose effects will swamp everything that went before. Keep in mind that TPP is not only the dozen countries negotiating it now, including the two of three largest national economies, U.S. and Japan, but there is increasingly a real prospect that China will want to join and will come in not in this first round, but in round two. And the reason is largely what Bill said, using different examples. Xi Jinping obviously has a major reform program in mind in China, and the recent plenum clearly demonstrates that. What better than to use an external trade negotiation to strengthen the hands of the reformers inside China who want to push those reforms? That's exactly what Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji did in joining the WTO 15 years ago. That is what Abe is doing in Japan now with his third arrow. And that is what I think China is headed toward. They realize they'll suffer some significant losses if they do not join TPP, because most of their major trade partners will be in it. Europe is also their second biggest, or now their largest, export market. So all their biggest markets will be in preferential agreements excluding them. Our calculations show that'll cost them at least $100 billion a year of trade and income. If that reason alone, they would want to join. But the dynamic impact that that would have on their internal reforms, I think, will push them in the direction of joining TPP. So it's not only what we have in mind now, which is already huge, but it's going to get, in my view, even huger. Now, this is the paradox, because when President Obama came into office, as I'm sure Jane will testify, he didn't want to touch trade. He didn't want to touch trade. He didn't even put forward for congressional approval the three trade agreements that he inherited from President Bush. Took him over 3 years to do it. But he did make one big exception in his first term, and that was TPP. And he did it for a simple reason: foreign policy and national security. I happen to be a little bit involved in how that happened. It's worth telling the story. Lee Kuan Yew visited Washington about a month before President Obama went to Asia for his first trip there in November of 2009. And Lee Kuan Yew, with a little bit of coaching and encouragement from outside, when he met with the president, said, "Mr. President, if you don't start taking economic initiatives in Asia, you're simply turning over our continent to the Chinese." And that got through. On geostrategic grounds, if not pure economic and trade grounds, the president reinserted the U.S. into the TPP negotiations, and from that point, they have taken off like a rocket and will achieve the kind of benefits we talk about. Now, with transatlantic added, I think it is fair to say this becomes the most aggressive, potentially beneficial era in U.S. trade policy history, and therefore the book and what the Wilson Center has done on it is extremely timely. Is this a good thing for the United States? We did a study at our institute, the Peterson Institute, now it's almost a decade ago. Larry Summers posed a question to us. He's been a board member of the Institute forever. And he posed a key question. He said, "Fred, in this debate over globalization, we're lacking one big thing. We need a number that will capture the impact of globalization on the United States." Big debate about globalization, pros and cons. We need to figure out empirically what its effects are. Well, that's a tall challenge. So I set my best team to work on it. In fact, 3 teams, and we did different models, different approaches. Fortunately, they all centered around the same outcome, regardless of the fact that different methodologies were used. The conclusion, and this was in 2004, was that the U.S. economy was about $1 trillion per year richer as a result of our integration with the world trading system over the previous 50 years. Now, that's a big number. It was about 10% of national income at the time. It suggested that every household was about 10% better off as a result of the U.S. participation in globalization for the previous half century. Now, of course, we didn't just stop with a net gain. We said, well, there are, and Bill said that, there are winners and losers. So there are gross costs. Some people lose jobs and have temporary or even longer periods of unemployment. Some have to take jobs at lower wages. So there are adjustment costs. So we calculated those at about $50 billion per year, not inconsequential. Something like 150,000 workers a year, adverse effects of the type I mentioned. Accumulates over time. Those are concentrated effects. So those losers, of course, worry about it and make a lot of noise and don't like trade agreements or globalization more broadly. But the benefit-cost ratio on our calculation is 20-1. And it underlines the point Bill made that the income benefits are plenty enough to compensate the losers. There, however, lies the political problem, which he rightly pointed to. We just don't do it. We have inadequate unemployment assurance in general. Obamacare will help in a big way because by providing portable health insurance, it's going to overcome one of the most important hang-ups about worker mobility to trade or anything else that dislocates that we've had in the past. But we need better unemployment compensation. We need a much better trade adjustment assistance program to deal with the labor part of the equation. We could easily afford it. That's going to be a big issue, I think, as the new trade agreements come before the Congress. The losers are obviously going to complain loudly and bitterly, and unless we do a better job of handling the cost side of the equation, those agreements may be in trouble, and the administration or whatever administration succeeds it before these things come to final fruition and to congressional approval are going to have to deal with that side of it. But the net effect is clear. But having said that comes the other big problem. I've talked about the big domestic problem, the adjustment costs. The big international problem, and again, Bill touched on it in the book and he mentioned it in his comments, is that the other countries don't always play by the rules. Now, I hasten to say the U.S. doesn't always play by the rules either. We're certainly no virgins in this respect. And we are quite rightly brought into the WTO or the NAFTA tribunals or various cases. So I don't pretend that the U.S. is beyond reproach. However, I will focus on the fact that other countries do cheat a lot, and particularly in the area that Bill underlined, they really cheat a lot, and that's the currency issue. Just today, a group of 8 senators and congressmen sent a letter to the president reminding him of the previous letters from 230 members of the Congress and 60 senators, a rather unique bipartisan bicameral majority these days, which insisted, and this letter today reinforces, insisted that the new trade agreements include anti-manipulation provisions if the Congress is to approve them. My suspicion is that is going to be the #1 issue between now and the time those agreements completed and the time they are brought to the Congress for approval. Because when you've got majorities of both houses telling the president and his top lieutenants that they're not going to approve the agreements unless a certain issue is addressed, the administration had better quickly wake up and start doing something about it. Today's letter says, you haven't done anything about that yet. We haven't, in fact, heard responses from you to our earlier letters. What gives? Let us remind you that unless you do it, you're not going to get your agreements approved. So this is a big deal. Now, the question is, should currency issues be handled in trade agreements? And there's a 2-part response to that. I'm probably one of the few economists who answers that with a resounding yes. I had a piece in the FT on it a couple of weeks ago. It's a handout to you today. I'm releasing a policy brief from the Peterson Institute in a couple of days that will lay out the case in detail and will suggest precisely how it could be done. And there's increasing support, I think, for that in the Congress and the business community and elsewhere. There are 2 issues. The one, of course, is whether it's a serious problem. In my view, it's a very serious problem. Bill talked about our trade deficit. I think you can attribute at least, underline at least, half our trade deficit to currency manipulation by other countries. China is, of course, by far the biggest, but it's by far not the only. There are at least 20 countries who manipulate exchange rates quite systematically, quite substantially. I mean, China is the poster child. It's built up $4 trillion of foreign exchange by intervening in the currency markets. buying dollars, selling RMB. That keeps the dollar much stronger than it ought to be, which makes the U.S. much less competitive than it ought to be, which detracts from the U.S. economy and creates lots of U.S. unemployment. I can go into all the details of that ad nauseum if you wish, but that's the basic line. Now, interestingly, only 2 current TPP countries are on my list of manipulators. China, of course, is not in the current TPP. So only 2 of the countries, smaller ones, Singapore and Malaysia, are actually in the TPP, and if its rules existed today, would be subject, probably, to those sanctions. That should make it relatively easy to negotiate because almost all the other TPP countries are adversely affected by manipulation. Not just the U.S. is adversely affected, but everybody else is too when these manipulators keep their currencies undervalued. But some big former manipulators, Japan, Korea, some others, would, I believe, be effectively deterred from future carrying out the same practices if an agreement to which they were a participant outlawed them and had sanctions. Meaning the traditional snapback idea where a country participating in a trade agreement which violates the terms of that agreement loses the advantages of the agreement. That's true if you violate your IPR obligations, it's true if you violate your tariff bindings, and it's true in this case if you violate your anti-currency manipulation obligations. So that, I think, is going to be the big negotiating battleground, and unless the administration thinks it can ignore the Congress, which as Jane said it can't, I think this is going to be numero uno big issue here in 2014. Final point. Bill also talks in his book, quite rightly, about the interaction between these mega-regional agreements that are now being negotiated and the global trading system. And trade purists tend to wail about the trend toward regionalism over the last couple of decades and the failure of the Doha round and the slippage in the WTO. I began to analyze that already 15 to 20 years ago. Ellen Frost will remember that. We talked about it frequently and vigorously. And I came up with something that I called the theory of competitive liberalization. And what it suggested was that the best way to reduce trade barriers was by moving simultaneously on different fronts, bilateral, regional, and multilateral. Now that was heresy at the time because the true blue multilateralists thought that any regionalism was deviationism and therefore to be avoided at all costs. But I noted that when you did a regional agreement like NAFTA or APEC as it was starting up at the time, which has now become the TPP, or even bilateral agreements among significant countries, that then put pressure on neighbors to either join the deal or do deals of their own that would similarly liberalize for 2 reasons. One, to reduce barriers to their exports as well, but also to strengthen their competitiveness by making them more open and therefore productive and all the kind of benefits that I talked about for the United States. So I think the record now of the last 15 to 20 years underlines and ratifies in spades that thesis of competitive liberalization because smaller bilateral and mini regional agreements have expanded and expanded and expanded. Now we've got mega regionals, as I said at the start, among the 3 big economic regions in the world. And to me, this is the best road back to Geneva. Because once you get these big mega regionals, then they themselves are going to say, well, now it's a little crazy, particularly the U.S., if it has its leadership hat on correctly, are going to say, well, now we've got these 2 big agreements, but they differ in these different respects. That makes for a confusing and sometimes contrasting set of arrangements and environments for business. And so the logical thing to do is to pull them together. And I believe that the road back to a global free trade strategy or multilateral liberalization strategy actually runs through these agreements. Remember that the Asians are also trying to negotiate a Pan-Asian agreement, the so-called RCEP. That adds on to the 2 big ones we're doing, although it's well behind and not nearly as advanced substantively. But when you put all those together, I think you come back to Geneva. That's controversial. It would take at least a decade to get to that point. But I do think it's by far the more likely route to the kind of globalization, basically free trade world that most of us would like to see, much more likely than trying to get 160 countries in the room, reach a consensus agreement across a wide range of complex issues. Much better to go at it through the more limited country approach, which will then, over time, add up to a comprehensive agreement. In any event, as you can see, I agree with practically everything Bill said in his remarks and in his book. I think it's an important contribution. I encourage all of you to read it. I encourage you to try to push your officials and your friends and your colleagues in the directions now needed to bring it to fruition, particularly on the domestic adjustment supports, particularly on the currency manipulation provisions, and all of that wrapped into hopefully a continued U.S. leadership role where we've gotten back on track, but now the issue is to make sure the Congress and the public as a whole support the strategy. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both Bill and Fred. I know we all have many questions. Many were covered, but still, we actually haven't talked about how you see the TPP and TTIP timelines, but I'm sure there will be questions from the audience later. But before I turn it to the floor, one issue that I am curious about that you didn't raise is this whole idea about the most favored nation status. And I'm thinking especially about Japan, which was the latest entrant into the negotiations. And it has the MFN status with most of the other TPP countries. How does the whole MFN status impact the ongoing talks, and particularly on agricultural goods?
Well, I very much agree with what Fred said on most favored nation treatment. I also strongly believe in most favored nation treatment. There's a lot of problems with free trade agreements. A big one is they tend to really encourage trade diversion instead of trade creation, and they have often very restrictive rules of origin that even expand trade diversion. So sometimes they may look like they're trade liberalization, but they really aren't. Another big advantage of the bilateral free trade agreements is that the least developed countries and the poorer countries tend to be excluded. They just simply aren't asked to the dance. So I agree with Fred. I'd like to see these agreements really become a good template, and to have that become the basis for future multilateral liberalization. And I think one of the things that we could start doing right away would be to better harmonize rules of origin in our bilateral agreements, and you could even bring together the U.S. free trade agreements in the Americas, like NAFTA and CAFTA and Chile, and make that a broader agreement, and I think that would be an improvement. I haven't given up on a successful Doha round. I think with the U.S. Budget problems, there may be a chance to deal with our agricultural subsidies, and I think with countries like China wanting to restructure, maybe there's hope that they will look at improved market access. So those would be my comments. And Fred?
Well, here again, I would deviate a bit from most of my trade policy brethren. I would not put such overwhelming emphasis on most favored nation treatment. As I said, I believe in competitive liberalization. That means I believe in creating preferential agreements which put pressure on other people by not giving them MFN treatment. And then they'll see a need to liberalize in order to join the club. Remember, when you give unconditional MFN, you give a lot of free riding away. You give away access to your markets to a lot of people who may not give anything away in the whole deal. Now, for the poorest countries in a WTO context, say that's fine. But the reason the Doha round broke down was because the U.S. and the Europeans we're not going to give unfettered increased access to their markets to the big emerging markets, the fastest growers in the world, who were not willing to make equal concessions. And once you liberalize on an MFN basis, you give access to everybody free of charge. So I believe in what I call conditional MFN treatment. I would open my agreements to everybody. I'd open TPP certainly to China and other countries at APEC. At least that's the construct so far. It might even get beyond that at some point. But I would do it on a conditional basis. If they're willing to play by the rules, then they get the benefits of the rules. But why do it otherwise? So I believe the original MFN concept, which was born out of Second World War, and there were only a few countries that were powerful trade players, and the rest of the world had to be helped up out of the wreckage of the war. I think that world is long gone. MFN, unconditional MFN, is kind of a fetish. It had a foreign policy objective back in Cordell Hull days, but I think it's a different world today, and so I would replace it with conditional MFN.
Thank you. If you have questions, if you could please wait for the microphone and identify yourself and keep your questions fairly brief.
Thank you very much. I'm Cindy Arnson from the Latin American program here at the Wilson Center. This is really a question for Bill, but for both of you. In the past, when there has been resistance to the approval of a free trade agreement in the Congress, it's mostly come from Democrats who are concerned about a labor constituency or precisely the unfair disadvantages that U.S. labor is subject to. Do you see with the current sort of reconfigurations, political reconfigurations on Capitol Hill, that there is a fundamental change in the coalition in favor of free trade, which was predominantly based in the Republican Party, with some number of Democrats, mostly from agricultural states, joining with others who could be sort of reassured that the labor provisions were being protected? I mean, does the rise of the Tea Party signal anything for a changing attitude towards free trade? Or are there other changes that we should be focusing on?
I have to admit I'm not as close to that as I used to be at some points in my career. I think my instinct is that if the agreements are constructed right, you're going to really have a lot less domestic opposition. If they're not constructed right, for example, the currency issue, I think you're going to have a lot of opposition. But I remember I worked for Sam Gibbons up on the Hill for a while, a very liberal Democrat who was very free trade. He was very worried about what would happen with the Tokyo round. But I think that agreement was structured well, and it ended up with a lot of support. The agreements that have had a lot more trouble, I think it's been more where the administration's has tried overly to push it through without building a consensus. My instinct is that the bigger problem might be on the Republican Party side with some real Tea Party, very conservative people, maybe less inclined for trade liberalization. But I don't know. Fred, are you?
Well, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the Hill politics of trade policy. I wish Jane were still here to comment on this. But at the end of the day, the Congress, and through their involvement, the administrations, almost always at the end of the day, decide trade agreements on foreign policy and national security grounds. NAFTA was not sold on economic grounds. It was sold, truth be told, by General Colin Powell, who at the time was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and went to the Hill and told the members that unless they signed on to NAFTA, one of his successors might have to put 5 divisions on the border because Mexico would become a failed state. And that got a lot of people to quickly sign on when they otherwise might not have done so. I mentioned President Obama, who came into office not wanting to touch trade, got into it because he realized that if he didn't, he might be, quote, ceding Asia to the Chinese. So the economics have to be at least neutralized. You can't get an agreement passed if you think it's going to be a terrible thing for the U.S. economy. As I suggested, it's not. It's a very good thing in general, and these agreements would be too. But the pivotal decisions are made on foreign policy and national security grounds. That's even true with big GATT or WTO agreements. The Kennedy round was the first big effort, President Kennedy's famous speech launching it, to create a transatlantic community. And here we are back again trying to strengthen the transatlantic community. In this context, a little bit defensively against the rise of China in the emerging markets. So those are the factors, particularly for regional agreements, but even for multilateral agreements, that really play a big and decisive role. And therefore, it's more, I think, the attitude that the administration takes and can convince the Congress to take vis-a-vis the U.S. role in the world as a whole and U.S. foreign policy, national security concerns that will turn the tide. Now, that, of course, doesn't answer the question. It just raises a different set of questions. What's the proper U.S. role in the world in the 21st century, and how does trade and economics fit into it? Most of us would say fits into it even more. And that was the Lee Kuan Yew appeal to President Obama, which succeeded in the case of TPP. When you talk about bringing China into the TPP, that's a pretty big idea. You would only do it if you thought it was a way of dampening the risk of a future confrontation between the United States and China. And there's some evidence from history that it would do that. I don't think you'd do it on pure economic grounds. I think you would do it on broader grounds of that type. So that, I think, is the set of variables that really are decisive and have to be very carefully thought through. And when you and an administration are marketing a trade agreement to the Congress, even at the startup, but certainly at the ratification stage, at the end of the day, that's where you have to come down. Which means, among other things, incidentally, that your national security team has to be in the front line of selling it to the Congress. The USTR can only carry it so far. It's got to be the national security team that's out front, with the president, of course, at the top of that pyramid, in selling the agreement and bringing the Congress along. People always say, the trade policy folks always say, the president has to get personally involved. Well, this is why. Because only he can make the national security case in a compelling way as commander-in-chief, which really permeates the trade issues.
Yeah, I'd like to add two other points, too. Number one, there is a middle thing that happens sometimes. Before Congress will approve an agreement, it will tell the administration to go back and redo something. Recently on the Korean agreement, for example, it told the administration to go back and address autos better than it did. And in the Tokyo round, it told the administration to go back and redo the government procurement agreement. Well, the problem with that is that the negotiations are basically over. The U.S. goes back to other countries and says, hey, look, we need to address this. Well, the other countries aren't very enthused about that, and you end up having often to pay a higher price. So I think it's important to get the agreement right when it goes up. The other thing that Jane mentioned that I think is important, I'd really like to see Congress pass trade promotion authority before these agreements are brought to Congress. I think Congress is much more likely to approve them if it has had a good debate on trade promotion authority first.
Yeah, I agree with that, although I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think they're going to approve trade promotion authority before TPP, though it would be the orderly and sensible way to do it. But the whole debate about trade promotion authority, in a sense, is ridiculous. The president should have permanent trade negotiating authority. It's ridiculous in the 21st century, where economics is so central to where trade is so central to our own economy and to the world economy, for the president not to be able to go out and negotiate trade agreements in the interest of the United States. Congress, of course, has to approve, and it should have a process for setting objectives and all that. But to have to debate every 10 years whether the president should have the authority to negotiate trade agreements is folly, and that should be overcome at some point, and hopefully some president and Congress will have the wisdom to do so.
Yeah, right.
I don't know if you're aware, but we actually have an overflow room because this event has proved to be very popular. And one of the questions that we have is, what do you think should be done and has not been done by TPP to bring big players like China on board. I really want to add to that and say, is it in the U.S. interest, should TPP go through, to have China be part of the agreement down the line? Or,
Well, the U.S. has taken the position, kind of, at least rhetorically, what I said before, that these regional agreements should be open. And others who agreed to play by the rules should be permitted to join. In the case of TPP, the whole thing arises out of APEC's commitment 20 years ago to achieve free trade and investment in the Asia-Pacific region. That's now bearing fruit through TPP. And the stated position of the U.S. and every other TPP participant is that the agreement is open to all other APEC member economies who are willing to meet the terms. So the question has been, is China willing and able to meet the terms? Now, the U.S. and the others all say this is going to be a 21st century trade agreement, world standards, et cetera, et cetera. Now comes currency as a big issue as well, new issue to put into the hopper. Does China want to play in that game? Well, until about a year ago, the Chinese characterized the TPP as an American plot to encircle them and to keep them down, part of the devious American strategy to avoid China's rise to global power status. Over the last 6 to 12 months, the Chinese attitude has changed dramatically. They now express keen interest. They want to learn about it, what's involved, what would we have to do, et cetera, et cetera. U.S. officials and others have said, well, China couldn't possibly meet the terms on, for example, state-owned enterprises. And the Chinese have now kind of looked around and said, well, but wait a minute, Vietnam's in there. And if Vietnam can meet the terms on state-owned enterprise you have in mind, well, surely we can, which is a fair question, to be debated, to be negotiated, but it's a fair question. And so my answer is yes, for the basically geostrategic reason I mentioned earlier. It would be highly desirable for China to join if, and only if, it is ready to meet the terms and conditions that, in this case, the other 12 member countries will have worked out. I mean, in a way, China missed the boat. They should have come in the first round, tried to be involved in negotiating the original template. Now, if they do want to come in round two, or Indonesia or others who also, I think, will undoubtedly want to come in, they're going to face a fait accompli. They're going to face an agreement that's been negotiated by 12 countries, approved, I hope, by the U.S. Congress and parliaments in the other 12 countries, and undoing that is going to be rather difficult. It's not impossible. China's a big country. It may come in and say, wow, we want to join, but we want these 3 tweaks. You know, maybe, if it's not too big. But the question is going to be the compatibility of their economic system and policies with the TPP as agreed by the initial 12. Now, go back to what I said earlier. If the Xi Jinping reforms are seriously intended and carried out effectively, they would amount to a substantial further liberalization of the Chinese economy, particularly in the services sector, and conceivably that would move them into a position where they could, with some transition periods and the usual elements in trade agreements, enable them to join. So is it desirable? I think unambiguously yes, because otherwise you run a risk of creating a new set of frictions. As I said, there are these Asia-only trade agreements going forward. China's at the center of those. China already has its own bilateral network with other Asian countries. They're about to conclude one with Korea, which will be a big addition. Only Japan would be outside their network. And so you would have 2 tracks of trade liberalization in the region. A Pacific track centered on TPP, including the United States, an Asian track centered on China, excluding the United States, and that could pose a whole new set of frictions and conflict between the world's 2 economic superpowers, which is not desirable. It would add to the security friction rather than represent an opportunity to temper the security friction. So again, back to the primacy of geostrategy and geopolitics, you have to think of it in those terms, but as I said, the economics have to be right. China has to be willing to play by the rules. The Xi Jinping reforms at least offer a possibility that over the next 5 to 10 years, because that's what we're talking about, nothing immediate, the thing might come together. If it did, good deal.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'd emphatically like to see China in at some point in time. I also think that just negotiating TPP with 12 countries is a pretty arduous task. A huge amount of progress has been made already, but it's a very difficult task. If there's too many countries involved, it's going to fail just like Doha failed, and probably for the exact same reasons. I mean, TPP is going to be a very difficult thing for Japan. They have a highly protected agricultural sector. Abe wants to restructure the economy. It's an important area to do that, but it's a very difficult area, and if they do it wrong, it'll cause all kinds of economic problems in Japan. So TPP already has a large mass. I think they need to reach an agreement and then encourage others to come on board. But I think it's also very, very important for U.S. negotiators to consult regularly and all the time. And by consult, I don't mean just going in there and saying, this is what we're going to do. I mean going in there and listening to other countries' concerns and taking those into account in the negotiating process. I think it needs to be a good agreement that others can join on to without having traps in it that will make it unacceptable.
Let me add one more point about China, and that's related to currency. As I said in my remarks, China has been by far the biggest currency manipulator. $4 trillion, $1 billion a day of intervention on average for the last 6 or 7 years. I mean, that's huge. And it's been a big factor in, as I said, half our trade deficit with the world. So some people say, well, that being the case, there's no chance China would join a TPP that has a currency clause in it. Well, I don't think that's right. The Xi Jinping reforms, among other things, coming out of the recent plenum, have said that they intend to get out of the intervention business. Now, I'll believe it when I see it, but they've said it, and over the last 2 to 3 years, they've tapered the amount substantially. And as I said, we're talking about a 5 to 10 year horizon over which, if they let the currency keep going up, even at the current modest rate, their current account surplus may come down to pretty low numbers. And if they do rebalance in the direction of domestic demand, again, at the heart of their strategy, blessed by the G20, pushed by the rest of the world, they might not need to do it. So I don't think that's a game stopper for China's coming in. And then remember the value it would have, because if you had a TPP with China in and a currency clause, then you would have a deterrent to all the big manipulators. China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Malaysia. You go right down the list, and you would have a powerful deterrent, namely the loss of their TPP benefits if they violated the currency rule. So it's the deterrent value that a currency clause would have and would be enormously valuable, and I don't think by any means rules out China coming in, again, on the timetable we're talking about. Not tomorrow, not even next year or the year after, 5 to 10 years down the road. That's when the stage 2 of TPP will get worked out.
Yes.
Thank you. It's Dana Marshall with Transnational Strategy Group, and congratulations, Bill, for that on your book, and Fred, for all that you and your team are doing on this all-important currency manipulation question. The question I have is based on a little bit of a shaky premise, which is my memory, which is not always the best, but it's of something that you will know because it's a report that the Peterson Institute did on TPP about the effect it would have on the U.S. economy. My recollection of that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that it would boost U.S. ag exports. It would boost U.S. business and financial services exports. And though it would increase U.S. manufacturing goods exports, it would actually increase the deficit in manufactured goods. At a time when there is so much activity on boosting U.S. manufacturing sector, my question is, how do we fix that problem? Or is Or perhaps is that not a problem in the view of the panel? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, look, we all know the U.S. economy is involved in very long-term structural changes. 100 years ago, agriculture was 50% of our economy. Now it's 1%. 40 or 50 years ago, manufacturing was at its peak, 30%, maybe a third of our economy. Now it's 18 to 20% of our economy, though 10% or less of jobs because of the rapid growth of productivity. And that rapid growth of productivity in manufacturing, double that of the economy as a whole, will continue to reduce the share of employment in the manufacturing sector. Those are long-term structural trends. Nothing we do in the trade area or anything else is going to change those in any major way. Bill enunciated at the start of his remarks the principle of comparative advantage. So what it means when we have an economy that's already 85% services is that the great opportunity for the U.S. from trade agreements is to expand our services exports. Our services exports are grossly underperforming. We have a $200 billion surplus in services. We have an enormous array of services which have not even tried to be exported. Seminal work by Brad Jensen at our institute has shown that 3/4 of the U.S. services economy is exportable, is tradable. People haven't thought about that, haven't realized it. Only a tiny share of services firms export. That's a vast opportunity. And that's where the big growth would come from. Your memory of the study is right. The effect on manufacturing is very small one way or the other. Manufacturing exports go up partly because other countries have higher barriers than we do. So if we literally negotiate a free trade agreement with other Asians and eventually maybe China, we, in pure mercantilist terms, get an advantage because their much higher barriers go to zero. Our barriers, already largely reduced, go to zero. So we get a trade advantage simply in terms of the changes of prices coming off the agreement. But that superimposes on this gradual, long-term downward trend of manufacturing, both as a share of the U.S. economy and particularly as a share of employment. You say a lot of efforts to restore manufacturing. I'm all for it, but good luck. It's sticking your thumb in the dike. There were a lot of people who said the same thing about agriculture in the 1930s when it had dropped halfway. Got to preserve American agriculture. Well, that would not have been the best bet on the future of the American economy. And today, I have to say, I don't want to sound callous about manufacturing, but it's not where our future is. And if we realize that and agree with that and try to exploit where our real comparative advantage is and is growing and is demonstrably hugely positive by a big international surplus, i.e. services, then I think we'll get the negotiations more properly structured.
I got to admit, I'm a bit of a manufacturing guy. I think it's important for the U.S. to have a strong manufacturing sector. I agree with Fred's comment that isn't going to be where the great job creation comes in the U.S. But manufacturing is important for services, too. There's an awful lot of services that are manufacturing related. I think there are things that can be done. It's nothing dramatic, but I mean, one thing, U.S. manufacturing in recent years has had a bit of a resurgence. Part of it is because of what's going on in energy. The U.S. is becoming a low-cost energy country, and that can help a lot of other industries like chemicals and things like that. So I think there's stuff going on. I don't remember the figures at all, but looking at it, I think the U.S. has been steadily dropping in the different international evaluations of the business climate. I think we were down to 7th or something like that. Well, okay, I think we should address those kinds of impediments. So, and then one last statement I'll make, and I think this is maybe a little controversial. You know, we've always had a debate here about should the U.S. have an industrial policy. Well, I mean, I absolutely don't think we should. Ours would be driven by short-term political involvement, and I think that would be a horrible mistake. But I think we need to look at our comparative advantage. We need to be open to considering the potential impact that other country practices can have on key U.S. industries. I mean, I think one of the best things that Obama did was really with regard to the auto industry. I think if the auto industry in the U.S. had gone under, we'd be in a disaster. So I think manufacturing is important, but I agree with Fred. I don't think it's where the huge job creation will be.
Let me come back again with one important caveat on what I said. The manufacturing sector is the part of our economy that is really screwed by the currency manipulation.
Yes.
I mean, 80% of our trade is manufacturers. A lot of the manufactured sectors are highly price sensitive. So a difference of only 5 to 10% in the price, not to mention undervaluations of like 30 to 40%, which for a long period China had engineered, that really hits the manufacturing sector. And as I said, that's unfair, and we ought to have done much more about it in the past, and we've got to do something about it now. And the major sectoral winner from that in the U.S. economy is manufacturing, because they're the ones that are hurt the worst by it. So in that sense, I'm all for an industrial policy, operating via exchange rate policy, to take that negative hit away from our manufacturing sector. And we should be sure, uber alles, to keep our exchange rate competitive forever and ever if we want to have an open trade policy.
There have been a number of questions from the overflow room about income inequality and how that is exacerbated by free trade. One person in particular quotes the Peterson Institute study that reports that as much as 39% of recent growth in U.S. wage inequality is attributable to trade trends. Do you think there is a direct correlation between the growing income gap in the United States and free trade or not?
Well, first off, income inequality has been growing around the world. The U.S. isn't the only country. However, it's probably grown more than in the U.S. than it has in other countries. I get into that a little bit in the book. There's a lot of causes of income inequality, education, technology, a lot of things like that. But trade is definitely a factor, and I don't think you can not focus on that. I mean, part of the unemployment, as we've talked about, is due to the trade imbalance. Well, if you're unemployed, you've got a pretty big income gap between somebody who's working. So I think that's one step, and I think the income inequality is a huge issue. I think trade is one factor, but I wouldn't want to deal with that by taking protectionist measures. I think that would be exactly the wrong thing. So I said everybody has this problem, and if you get into beggar thy neighbor actions, you're really going to create a disaster.
Yeah, the unambiguous answer to your question is yes. There is a direct correlation between globalization and increasing income inequality. As Bill says, that's happening in practically every country, all of whom are globalizing. China has had a dramatic increase in income inequality, much more than we have.
Yeah,
sure. As it has gone through an enormous wave of globalization. I mean, in the last 30 years since the Deng Xiaoping reforms, China moved from an autarkic country to the most open of all major developing countries, the most open. The trade to GDP ratio in China, exports and imports over GDP, is over 60. Here it's around 30. In Japan it's around 20. In India it's around, well, it was 20 until recently, now it's risen. China is a hugely open economy. It has globalized faster than any big country in history. Incidentally, the U.S. has globalized faster than any rich country in history over the last 50 years. But it too has seen an enormous increase in income maldistribution. So then the question, so the fact is clear. Then there are two questions. A, how important is it? Is it, like most economic studies have shown, modest, meaning 20%, Or is it bigger? Like, I think that's an old Bill Klein study by us that showed maybe 40. Some people have said even bigger, half. And to be honest, economists don't know. The methodology for that is very difficult to discern. I'd say anywhere between a quarter and half is justifiable and defensible. So it's pretty significant. But then the question is what you do about it. Do you cut off the trade? Well, as I said, the benefit-cost ratio, at least as we analyze it, is 20 to 1. So that would be kind of stupid to deviate in that way. But then you need to have other policies, like some we already talked about, but more macro policies, more graduated income tax schedules, direct help to unemployed workers like unemployment insurance, not to mention TAA. There are a whole lot of other things you can do to avoid throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But unless you do them, then the politics points you in the direction of maybe throwing out the baby too. And that's the ongoing problem that we talked about before. But income redistribution is a component of what Bill and I both talked about, the adverse adjustment effects of globalization, incidentally, of any dynamic economic change. It's not just global, we're talking about trade today. It's not just globalization, it's technological change, it's all sorts of change. Because any of those dynamic economic changes are built on the principle of comparative advantage, meaning you do more of what you do better. And when you do more of what you do better, the people who do those things are better off. And income and wages in the export sector are 20% higher than the national average. No surprise. That's the things we do better. They get better remunerated. The more of that we do, the more those people benefit, and the more the income distribution becomes uneven. Do you say as a result of that we shut down Boeing? Well, of course not. Do you shut down technology innovation? Well, of course not. And it's sort of ludicrous that people say on the same arguments, we ought to shut down trade. Well, no. And the same people would never say shut down innovation. They sound like Luddites. And to be truthful, it's the same with trade. But you have to find out alternative mechanisms to deal with the adverse effects. And that's a macro issue. We've dealt with it politically through trade adjustment assistance because it helped get trade bills through. But in truth, that's not satisfactory. We really should be dealing with the income distribution problem, the poverty problem, the low income, the income stagnation problems on their own and through aggregate economy-wide measures.
We're running out of time. Maybe we can take a couple of questions together. So if you could keep your question brief. Yes.
Thanks, Ben Beachy with Public Citizen. Bill, you mentioned a couple of legitimate concerns that critics have had with past agreements, including the abuses of the investor-state system and outdated restrictions on capital controls, to name two. And you mentioned, the TPP should seek to improve on or to address such concerns. But the leaked investment chapter that has been seen for the TPP actually replicates almost word for word the standard investor-state chapter found in prior agreements. In fact, the only differences are an expansion of the scope of policies that can be implicated by the chapter, and the same ban on capital controls is found in that text as well. So the question is, how can, given that essentially replication of the same standard template, how can the TPP be seen as a meaningful addressing of those legitimate concerns you mentioned?
If you could hold off just a minute. I saw, yes, one.
Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. I came a few moments late, but I had glanced at the book before. I come from a world where we talk about Africa all the time, and Africa is a new growing continent, the future of the world, et cetera, et cetera. Then I come into my normal trade policy groups and all the expertise that are here, and Africa is barely mentioned. Is it a region that is still 30, 40 years away from really playing a major role? Or is it something that if we do not get there soon and allow the Europeans with their partnership agreements and the Chinese to really get well positioned and so on, where we're dealing with NGOs and do good policies, where we're going to pay an economic price? I don't know what is the timing of Africa as far as this impact goes. Thank you.
go first?
Okay. Yeah, well, real quick on Steve's thing on on Africa. There was a very good study. I think it was by AID on, if I remember right, it was called the African cheetahs compared to the Asian tigers. But anyway, there's a number of countries in Africa that are really growing very well and doing very well. They're trying to deal with things like corruption and governance and what have you. And I think that's really important. And Steve, you know infinitely better than I do, but I think it's really important to renew AGOA and GSP and help stimulate all of that. But in terms of negotiating a free trade agreement with them or anything like that, I think our priority needs to be TPP and the TTIP, and then have a framework that they can accede to down the road. In terms of how can the TPP better meet the concerns on things like investor-state dispute settlement and currency capital controls, I think Australia is very upset about investor-state dispute settlement. I think the U.S. needs to really listen to what Australia's concerns are and address them. I think that they're very legitimate concerns. And I think we need to listen to our partners on capital controls. I think negotiators really need to listen. One of the problems, of course, is a lot of what's going on in the negotiations isn't very transparent. And I think that they do need to address the transparency issue. A lot of these agreements will have a far-reaching impact in the U.S. And I think there's probably a lot of people in the U.S., for example, that would agree with some of the concerns that the Australians have on investor state. So I think my answer to that is I just think the negotiators need to really listen. But, you know, we're not at that end game yet on these negotiations, and you don't really change your positions until you get into the end game. And so at that point, I hope the U.S. will be flexible on those things and use that as a way to press for things like currency manipulation that we really need to get addressed.
One sentence on each of the three questions. Africa is a rapidly growing area, but it's 43 tiny countries. If the Africans would get their act together and create an economic union in Africa, I can tell you the U.S., Europe, and everybody else would be lined up trying to negotiate a deal with them. But how are you going to deal with 43 individual little countries, none of which on its own is big enough to worry about, to put it bluntly? So if they could consolidate, wow, then you'd have not only cheetahs, you'd have one big feline something.
Elephant. You'd have an elephant.
Everybody, well, a fast-moving elephant that everybody would want to negotiate with, you know. So I don't think the Africans would do that overnight, but that's the answer. On the capital controls and free trade agreements, much debated among theorists, including many of my colleagues at the Institute. Keep in mind the practical consequences so far have been zero. The U.S. has never, repeat, never invoked that clause of the previous FTAs in which it's been included, which are Singapore and Chile. In fact, to my knowledge, the U.S. has never even thought about invoking those clauses. So it creates a lot of theoretical angst in some quarters, zero practical effect. On ISDS, almost the same. There have been a few cases, a few celebrated cases, but practical impact is very, very modest. I wouldn't put a lot of U.S. negotiating weight on maintaining them. Incidentally, the new Australian government now says they're willing to go along with it, so I think it'll find its way into TPP. But I think it's overstated by both sides in terms of practical impact because there have been very few cases, and the economic consequences are so minuscule you can't even see them.
I'm afraid we're actually out of time, so I do apologize if I didn't get to you today. I wanted to point out that Bill's book is available for sale outside the door, and I'm sure he will also be available to answer any questions you may have individually as well. I also wanted to point out that he has a blog to continue this conversation online at americastradepolicy.com. And with that, I hope you'll join me in thanking both Bill and Fred for this discussion. And thank you very much for coming.